Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from Yarkspiri and today I'll be going through three different tools. I'll be going through the Dodge tool, the Burn tool, and the Sponge tool. Now these tools do work a little bit differently. They work fairly similar to the layer blending modes, but there is some slight differences in how these ones work specifically. You tend to have a lot more control over these elements than you do in um, the blending modes in your layers panel. So first off, let's start off with the Dodge tool. So as you can see, I can actually select what range I actually want to modify. So right now it's set to highlights, but I can actually choose highlights, midtones, or shadows. I'm going to keep it on my highlights for now. I've also set my exposure to 100%. I've done this so that you can actually see the difference a lot more clearly. As in previous tools, you can actually select your full array of brushes. I'm just going to select the hard round brush because you'll be able to see the differences a lot more clearly. So I'm just going to click in here so you can actually see some of the difference. As you can see, it's really lightening up this drawing, and it's essentially lighting up all my darks, midtones, and highlights. Now, because it's set to highlight, it's mostly affecting my highlights first. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change it to midtones so you can see what the difference is. So as you can see, it's actually affecting the mid color range much more in comparison to the highlighted area. And if I change this to the shadow area, it's actually going to affect the shadows much more. So you can actually see that there's actually quite a difference in the colors that are being affected. So that's the three of them here. So if I go back to my initial drawing and back again, you'll be able to see the differences that occurred. So this tool is really good to use if you're trying to lighten up some certain key areas in your drawing or painting. You do have to be careful not to overuse it. I've actually set it to 100%. You normally wouldn't do so just because the changes would be too severe. But if I start applying this to my character, as you can see, it's actually begun lightening up certain key areas and really bringing out some of the lighter areas. But because it's set to shadow, it's also removed most of my color. So that's something you have to be aware of, is it tends to remove the colors that you originally had. So that was the Dodge tool. We're going to go to the Burn tool. Now this tool works very similar to the color burn layer blending mode that you do have available. There is some slight differences. Once again, as before, you can actually choose between the shadows, midtone, and highlights. You can also choose the type of brush you want to use. I'm going to go with the hard brush so you can see this much more clearly. And I'm also going to set this once again to 100%. So I'm just going to set this to highlights first. Now, it can take a while for the computer to actually fully implement this. So as you can see, if I click back and forth, it's actually darkened that entire area. The change is not very significant because the highlights were selected. So we're going to go back to midtones and we're going to affect that. And as you can see right off the bat, there was a much more significant effect in the midtones. Just going to go over to highlight a bit more so you can actually see this a little bit more clearly, the difference. It does take quite a bit more work in order for the effects to actually be seen with the highlight option. And now I'm going to set it to shadow, so it's actually going to do this quite quickly, and it's darkening up all my shadows extremely quickly. If you wanted to use this, the best way to use this is if you're trying to darken up certain areas and really punch up some of the shadows. So in my top character here, I'm just going to do that in certain areas here, and as you can see, it's not really going to touch any of my really highlighted areas. It's just going to darken up um, areas that have enough shadow in them already. So essentially it's just emphasizing the shadows that are already there. It's making them more sharp. So now I have a much more sharp look to this character in comparison to what he looked like before. We'll go, this is before, this is after. Okay, so we're going to go to this sponge tool. I'm going to start with desaturate, and essentially what it's going to do is it's actually going to remove color as I paint with this. In comparison to saturation, which is going to add additional colors and pigment to that area. So essentially this is just increasing the amount of color that's within that area. I'm just going to emphasize the desaturation a little bit more. So as you can see, it's actually removing most of those color areas almost entirely. If I go in here, you can actually see it more. And it's essentially changing this almost to grayscale. So if you use this tool, you'll notice more significant changes, especially in any highly colored areas. Because I have the texture here, you don't notice it as much, but because there's actually a painting here, you can notice it a lot more. So that was it for this week's tutorial. It was very short. These tools you probably actually won't end up using. I do prefer using the blending layer options that I have available in my layers panel. The reason why I use those is because I do have the option of always turning them off, especially if that portion has been painted on a different layer. Now there is pros and cons to both, however. One of the problems with using this method and changing your blending mode, so if I do use the color burn and put this on a different layer, when I try to flatten this out, it can become quite problematic in that it may not apply the flattening of the image elements properly. So you may actually end up changing these to a normal layer instead of the normal blending option that you had originally. The only way I've found so far to try and get around that is to group those layers into a separate group and then flatten it entirely. Another method, if you wanted to flatten out just those elements, is the best thing to do would actually be to flatten out the entire image. Now there's pros and cons to that, obviously, because you can't go back after. You would have to incrementally save prior to doing that. Now, unlike the layer blending modes, however, these changes that are done with the sponge, the dodge tool, and the burn tool, these are actually done to the image itself. So you can't actually go back after X amount of changes and undo them. You can go back to your original drawing, but depending on how far back that was, the changes could be significant to the point where you'd essentially be restarting your piece. So because of the flexibility allowed to me with the layers, I tend to use that the most. So that's it for this week's tutorial, and I hope to see you guys soon. So thank you and take care.